This is an RNZ podcast.
Kia ora and welcome to the Kim Hill Collection. Kate Camp is a writer, a poet, a critic, and a bit of a legend on Saturday morning, it's fair to say. For over a decade, she would regularly appear on the show, chatting to Kim about old books and writers in a recurring segment called Kate's Classic. Classic with a K, naturally. In this chat from 2004, the two are discussing the work of Katherine Mansfield. Hope you enjoy it.
Kate Camp joins me now to address Katherine Mansfield.
That's right, the lovely
Katherine.
KM. Well, now you're staring at me.
I'm
staring at me in a bold way.
Justify
I
that.
was just going into a reverie.
Not
thinking,
more about Katherine Mansfield.
Yeah, well, I was going into a reverie thinking about how scholars call her Katherine and they call her KM and how they tend to sort of talk down to her or in a sort of in a very affectionate way. But there's always been that thing of her being treated like a bit of a girl, you know, when she's really should be referred to at all times as Mansfield. But I can remember when we were kids, me and my sister would always go, the minute Mum mentioned Katherine Mansfield, we'd always go, boring old Katherine Mansfield. Mum was always rabbiting on about Katherine Mansfield. So, and rereading the stories, which I have read a lot of before at university, rereading them. Now I know why she was rabbiting on. She was so right. Katherine Mansfield is a genius.
Oh, a real genius.
Yeah, she's brilliant.
I know
so
why
great.
she inspired irritation there, because I've got this copy. It's quite an old copy. 1974, this edition was published. And the fly cover, is that what it's called, the fly cover?
I think so.
Sounds disgusting. Anyway, the fly cover says...
The fly cemetery.
Katherine Mansfield has been described as the one peacock in New Zealand's literary garden.
Yeah,
which,
take that,
excuse
you
me,
chooks.
but yeah, that is certainly damning with faint praise. The entire oeuvre of the Antipodes.
It absolutely is. But I think it's interesting that New Zealand only really has two authors of international standing who even register on the international radar, really, and they are Katherine Mansfield and Janet Frame. And it's interesting that both of them are famous in New Zealand, at least for their child's eye view. And I was thinking, I don't know whether that's because they're particularly good at writing from a child's point of view.
Or they've never grown up.
Yeah, or we've never grown up. And maybe our favourite stories, because of course Mansfield wrote dozens and dozens of stories about terribly grown-up people, but the ones that I'm looking at today all are really focused on children, and they are the best known and most sort of best loved and revered stories in New Zealand. But maybe that's the audience, not necessarily the author.
Well, I mean, Prelude, when you read Prelude, and also to some extent At the Bay, but in Prelude, all the adults except the grandmother are children. They're childlike. You know, there's Linda Burnell, whom I want to slap half the time. Don't you?
She's sort of Valium, you know, she's sort of on natural Valium.
And Stanley, that, you know, you pay good money not to sit next door to dinner party.
I know, Stanley. Although I felt more affectionate about Stanley this time round. I mean, I used to, what I remembered about At the Bay was Stanley, and he's such a pain in the ass, but he's actually not as bad as I remembered. I felt a bit more sympathetic towards
But in
Stanley.
Prelude, you know, he's depicted, she's very ambivalent about men. Isn't she?
Yeah.
So there's Stanley, and he's picking his teeth and scratching and smug and vain and blustering. There's Beryl, who's whinging and frustrated.
I know. Beryl's a very desperate character, and having just recently read Cranford and then, you know, reading 19th century novels a bit as I do, it made me think, you know, Beryl is very much that character, the woman with a limited life, and it sort of corrupts her because she can't have a life. She can't be independent because she's not married, so she's living with her sister and brother-in-law, and she's sort of forced to be a rather petty, desperate character, really, because she can't get out and get a, you know, sensible job at the National Library or something and be perfectly happy.
Yeah.
So,
I know that's true. I know I should feel compassion for Beryl.
That's why she drives you nuts. I mean, that's the point. But she's sort of, it's like, I find Beryl, you know, I think I said about Portrait of a Lady, it's very embarrassing because you feel that you're being seen, your own sort of idiotic, self-conscious ways of thinking are being revealed to the world. Well, that's how I feel about Beryl.
How did Henry know that?
I just cringe when I read Beryl and the silly things that she does, and I can feel myself blushing now. Thank goodness I've got a blushing face of radio, but because I really can relate to her.
But we used to do those things when we were 13, Katie, but we don't. How old is she? She's a grown-up
Yeah,
person.
she is. She is. I'm desperately trying to pretend that I've never done anything quite so silly as Meryl since I've been a grown-up person. But the things she does, like she has that sense of herself, like she's playing the guitar and she's sort of watching herself from the outside, thinking how lovely she looks playing the guitar and how white her hand looks, and looking at herself not in the mirror but in the mirror of her own imagination. And
What she also does, however, Beryl, is she looks at herself and thinks, "Oh, what a stupid false
and then
phony."
later she thinks, I'm such a fake, and so but I love the sense of Katherine Mansfield, and of course once I started thinking about the Janet Frame connection I couldn't stop, and I was thinking one thing that they really do have in common is they're brilliant at observing the real details of life and giving a sense of how the unconscious urges sort of swell up and overtake the conscious life, and they're kind of this fracture within the real world where all the unconscious urges and silly sort of betrayals of your inner truths are coming out all the time, and that they've both got that interplay between the two, so that the inner life becomes this sort of distorting lens through which you're looking at the real world, and they're very exact. I mean, Katherine Mansfield's stories are the detail is absolutely exact, and she's looking back at New Zealand in these stories from overseas, so she's, there's a certain amount of nostalgic sort of desire to itemise everything from the past, and from her, I mean, nostalgia, doesn't that mean wanting to be in your home country?
Yeah.
And so she's got that sort of that sense of that, and yet at the same time as she's got the exactness, there's also that surreal quality which you see in Frame, but you also see in Mansfield in things like when they go out into the garden and look at the aloe.
Yeah. The fat swelling plant with its cruel leaves and fleshy stem.
I don't know what Freud was talking about.
Sometimes an aloe is just an aloe.
That's right.
Aloe,
exactly.
aloe. My favourite bit of Katherine Mansfield, full stop, I reckon, is the beginning of At the Bay.
Yeah.
And her description
amazing?
of the early morning and the sun coming up over the sea.
right.
It was just stunning.
And that
the
opening
sheepdog.
sentence, yeah.
How does the go? The sheepdog ran along with his nose to the ground, but carelessly, as if thinking of something else.
Yeah, and then when the
It's
shepherd
perfect.
lights his pipe, it says the sheepdog looked up at him in a very trusting way.
Yeah.
It's just great. And the opening line of At the Bay is very early morning. It's really like a prose poem, that whole opening of At the Bay. There's 3 paragraphs, 2 short ones, and then a long third paragraph that's almost a page long, and the image is of dew and water everywhere on the land early morning, and she uses the image, she says it's as if the sea had come up during the night and washed over the land, and you might expect to turn around and see a fish flopping on the lawn. And if you sort of take Jung's word for it that the sea is the unconscious, then that's like a perfect sort of schema of Katherine Mansfield's work, that idea that in the dark time the unconscious can well up and sort of saturate every part of your normal daily existence. Yeah, and it's also just very nostalgic, like there's a lot going on in Mansfield, but you can also just read it as pure, indulgent Kiwiana if you are a Kiwi.
The silvery, fluffy toy was limp on his long stalks. Yeah, that's right.
And then my favourite bit is when she talks about the batches, although the word's obviously not in use at that time because she never uses it, but she says the green blinds were drawn in the bungalows of the summer colony. Over the verandas, prone on the paddocks, flung over the fences, there were exhausted-looking bathing dresses and rough striped towels. Each back window seemed to have a pair of sand shoes on the sill and some lumps of rock or a bucket or a collection of pawa shells. The bush quivered in a haze of heat.
You can just smell it.
Yeah.
I love it.
And I love the way, and pawa is spelt throughout P-A-W-A, which
Yeah.
gives it this really sort of 19th century flavour. But,
That's right.
it's just so evocative of those long summers. And she talks about how in the middle of the day the sun is so blinding, the glare off the water is so blinding, it's almost impossible to be at the beach.
It's sort of under Milk Woodish, isn't it?
Yeah.
That opening.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, I've just been reading John Clarke's version of A Child's Christmas in
Isn't he
Warrnambool.
clever?
Oh, he is brilliant.
He is such
He
an
is
ear.
just-
For the uninitiated, he's done a whole book of poems written in the voice of all these incredibly highfalutin poets, and he's imitated them. He's ripped them off. He's satirised them in the most clever way.
Oh, and I mean, he is so clever that the parody actually sort of gets left behind, and they just become brilliant poems in their own right. And that one is absolutely brilliant.
And what it also does, strangely, is helps you to understand the original voice better.
Yeah, and how it worked. That one was a real cracker for me.
Anyway, back to Katherine.
Back to Katherine. I'm sure John Clarke's got a lot of things he thinks about Katherine Mansfield. But I mean, I really was surprised at how much I enjoyed reading the stories. I mean, I know that sounds silly, but I guess I'm used to thinking of Mansfield as being a great author, but I'm not used to thinking of her as someone I really enjoy reading.
Yeah.
But I did enjoy just reading them so much.
I reckon if there's only one story of Katherine Mansfield you got time to read, it's got to be at the Bay. I reckon.
Yeah, and especially if you're a Wellingtonian, but just generally either. And the Garden Party I had read recently because I was reading things set in Wellington and looking for a short Mansfield story. And the Garden Party really is about class. But I love the scene at the end that captures the final scene of the Garden Party where they've had this party and the daughter has wanted to call it off because there's been a death in the little poor workmen's cottages down the road.
Oh, don't be ridiculous,
and
darling.
It's all about class, the whole story is about class, but somehow Mansfield manages to needle the middle class pretensions while still keeping you in sympathy with the individuals. And maybe it's because they're children that you don't sort of get into this huge sort of blame thing of going, oh, isn't it awful how they're so classist. And then she goes down where the carter has been killed and goes to the house, and the carter's, the dead man's sister-in-law, is there smiling in an oily way and smiling slyly at her, and she goes down with her basket full of broken meringues to give to the family. It's just with her big hat on after the garden party. And afterwards she leaves with her brother after she's seen the carter's body, and he says, "Don't cry," he said in his warm, loving voice. "Was it awful?" "No," sobbed Laura. It was simply marvellous." But Laurie, she stopped, she looked at her brother. "Isn't life," she stammered, "isn't life..." But what life was she couldn't explain. No matter, he quite understood. "Isn't it, darling?" said Laurie. And that sense of there being something ineffable that and it's always often the young people who have that sense that there's something like the little lamp in the doll's house. I seen the little lamp. It's just exquisite, and I find the stories incredibly moving in a way that I never did when I was reading them.
That's
when I was
my other
younger.
fave. The doll's house is fantastic.
What
What I'd forgotten about the garden party was that the party itself takes barely a page.
That's right. It's
nothing
all
to do with
about
the garden party.
margins.
Yeah.
That's right. And I mean, that's what where Mansfield really is that it's all happening in the preparation, in the anticipation, and then the memory of events in life rather than in the big events themselves. And I mean, I think that's probably very true of your real experience of life. And she very rarely comments in a sort of George Eliot-ish type of way or anything. She very rarely says anything straight out about life, but when she does, they are always totally spot on. Like, I'm just looking for the part in my notes here of when she says, when Linda is lying out on the lawn with her little baby son, and she says, that she never loved her children.
No.
And this is sort of the revelation that comes that. And the minute she makes the revelation, it's also revealed as sort of being yet another facade and perhaps not being true. And the fact that she sort of said it, then you think, well, maybe that isn't true after all. And a little later, I think it's Beryl says in a monologue, "It is true, when you are by yourself and you think about life, it is always sad." And that really captures something about those the inner worlds of the characters, and yet their lives aren't sad. And I don't think the overall ambiance of the stories there's nothing sad about it, but there is that sense that when the garden party or when the first ball or whatever the action is, when the action goes quiet, there's that sense of melancholy.
I don't get that last line of prelude, "Then she tiptoed away far too quickly and airily." But we haven't got time to talk about it now. Thank you, Kate. Kate Camp, talking about the short stories of Katherine Mansfield. It's 11 o'clock now.